Hi, Dan.
Hey Rachel, how are you? Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too. I'm good. Thanks so much for taking the time to record this today.
Absolutely. One last dose of politics and current events before the end of the year. What do you say?
Yes, sounds perfect.
Okay.
So, our first audience question, which we didn't get to during the program earlier this month, is do you think the Republican Congress will actually pull back from supporting Ukraine?
Hey. Right now, it looks like the Republican Congress is split over Ukraine. There's a fairly vocal portion among the Republican caucus, particularly in the House, that wants to see aid to Ukraine cut back. But it looks like a majority of the Republican congressional members, primarily but not exclusively in the Senate, do want to keep that aid going. And when you push all but the most ideologically intense House members a little bit more specifically on this, what you'll hear them say is that they don't necessarily want to cut aid to Ukraine. They just want to oversee it more specifically. The Biden administration has agreed to those requests and is adding additional oversight on the considerable amount of money that the United States is now spending in Ukraine. But it looks like, for all the bluster, it's a relatively small number of conservative Republican House members who'd go further than that.
Great. So, continuing on the topic of Ukraine, what is your reaction to Ukraine bombing Russian airfields?
This has really been a very dramatic change in the trajectory of the war. Because from the very beginning, as soon as the United States and the other Western countries began supplying Ukraine with military support, they were very careful not to give them weaponry that would allow them to make significant incursions into Russia. In other words, they wanted to see this being a defensive effort. And as Biden has said on many occasions, he doesn't want to see us start to World War III. But as the Russian aggression has continued, and even as Ukraine has made considerable gains on the ground in the eastern part of the country, because Russia has been bombing more and more aggressively, while the US and its Western allies are very careful not to encourage, at least not publicly encourage, Ukraine to bomb inside of Russia, they're not being nearly as vocal about the downside of it. And what seems to have happened is that while Ukraine is not getting overt support for these more aggressive actions into Russian territory, they're feeling more comfortable about mounting air attacks into Russia without worrying about any kind of pushback from the US or NATO.
And finally, what Taiwan-related lesson does China draw from the Western response to Russia's war in Ukraine?
Well, that might be the most important question of broader consequence in this entire discussion. Because one of the things, and I know you've noticed it all, Rachel, is throughout the year, whenever we've asked our members, whenever we've asked our audience what they see as the greatest challenge to the US on the world stage, even at the height of the war in Ukraine, our people, our members, our audience has always kept their eye on China and warned about the potential challenge that China faces. So as important as the war in Ukraine is in itself, I think a lot of smart people, including our audience, are watching it very carefully, not only to see what happens in Eastern Europe, but what its ramifications might be on the Pacific Rim. And from the very beginning, there's been two absolutely diametrically opposed schools of thought in how to answer that question. One school of thought says that China is thinking that because the US and NATO and other allies have come together in such a more unified way, in such a more ongoing fashion than many would have predicted at the outset of the war, that might be giving the Chinese some hesitation about going into Taiwan aggressively because they feel they too might face that type of unified resistance on the world stage. The other diametrically opposing school of thought is that China thinks that as the US and NATO become more and more distracted by the war between Ukraine and Russia, that increases the opportunity for them to move aggressively against Taiwan. We raised that question probably back in March for the first time, Rachel. We've talked about it several times over the course of the year. And I don't think we're any closer to knowing an answer now than we were 9 months ago. Two really smart analyses. They are in direct contradiction to each other. And so we really don't know how China is reacting to the war in Ukraine. One thing worth noting, though, is that just before the war started, you may remember, Russia and China had a very highly visible summit in which the Chinese leaders proclaimed their lifelong alliance with Russia. Well, even though China continues to trade with Russia and continues to provide them an economic lifeline to keep the Russian economy afloat, China's leaders are now also making it clear that they don't support the use of nuclear weapons. And they've offered other very, very measured criticisms toward Russia's conduct over the course of the war. It's not enough to weaken the alliance between those two countries. It's not enough to push China out of the Russian orbit. But it is notable that because, in addition to the US, China is very, very aware of how it's regarded across the world, in North and South America, in Europe, in Asia, and Africa, that they realize that being seen as too overtly supportive of Russia isn't in their best interests. But will that encourage or discourage them on Taiwan? We still don't know.
Yes, we will have to wait and see. But thank you so much again, Dan, and looking forward to being back in January to talk about the new Congress.
And maybe that's the fitting way to wind up a very tumultuous year, Rachel, to admit that there's a lot of unanswered questions. And going forward, hopefully we'll learn a lot more, and I'll certainly be able to talk it through a lot more, and hopefully come to some additional solutions as we go.
Yes, definitely. I agree. Looking forward to it.
You too. Listen, have a really safe trip and a very happy holidays. And I look forward to seeing you, and look forward to seeing everybody again right after New Year's on Tuesday, January 3rd.
Yes, happy holidays, and we'll see you again on the 3rd.
I look forward to it. Thanks again for everything, Rachel.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Bye.